Hi, we're talking with Osse, who is the council member for the 36th district of New York City Council. Chi is an extraordinary politician and activist who is, I think you were the youngest council member ever elected, right? When you were 23, when you were elected, is that right?
Of this class, I just found out maybe a couple months ago that a man named William Rivera won at 22 years old based off of a special election that his father represented in 2002. So I'm the second youngest.
The second youngest, but no coattails for you. So
Exactly.
a little different. I'll just put you in a different category. Did it yourself. Okay, I'll say that. So, so Chi came up through he worked as and was the model for activism during the actually before Black Lives Matter, Warriors in the Garden. He was the leader of Warriors in the Garden, a Black Lives Matter sort of advocate, community activist, profoundly engaging. And from there, you built up sort of, yours was not up the plan. It wasn't some grand plan to become a politician. The political part kind of just sort of happened to you, and you had to make a kind of conscious choice, and I think a challenging choice, to move from the realm of activism into the realm of politics, which involves a lot more kind of compromise. Was that a difficult transition for you, a difficult choice?
It was a transition that, I didn't really give much thought into until it was all happening to me. And it's still a transition that I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis, especially through, watching the things that I say and how I say them. However, it's a choice that I am very comfortable that I made through the work and the power that I'm able to leverage to achieve the same sentiments and feelings and values that I had since the day before I ran for office.
Well, speaking of feelings and values, it's those very feelings and values which have inspired me to work toward your election, work on your campaign, but also to sort of think about you as a representative of a new model for talking about all kinds of issues, but in this instance, mental health, mental well-being, mental illness, and how we contend with mental illness culturally, how our city manages it, how our country manages it, and how we understand it in regards to historical discrimination, racism, and oppression. And so I want to start by reminding people who might not know about this that John F. Kennedy, almost 60 years ago, was addressing Congress. He had a historic address to Congress in which he said, he was talking about community mental health centers, which are going to be this new model for mental health. States were no longer going to be institutionalizing people with severe mental illness. They were going to be let out of these institutions, and the federal government was going to step in with these residential mental health services. And he said, quote, "The reliance on the cold mercy of custodial institutions and isolations will be supplanted by the open warmth of community concern and capability." And he suggested he was going to bring in a federal takeover, and it was going to make everything better. People who had severe mental illness were going to have local community-based resources. They were going to have local community-based sensitive therapy. That isn't what happened. What happened was people who with less severe illnesses were typically managed by community-based mental health centers, but people with severe mental illness essentially were warehoused and then ignored. So we have this horrific sort of, I'll call it another kind of pandemic of unattended, unacknowledged mental illness, and particularly in communities which had been historically excluded from mental health resources, communities of color, low socioeconomic status communities in which mental health itself was a stigmatized concept owing to generations of racism. We have essentially so few resources, and we see outcomes, unfortunately, like what happened yesterday on the train, where somebody who is most likely significantly ill and with access to firearms was able to engage in an act of violence, which was a function of presumably his unstable mental health. And so our country currently spends more than $150 billion a year to try to manage mental health, and we do it unsuccessfully. And so my questions are, how do you understand, in terms of your community, the 36th district, which is Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, for those of you who don't know, how do you understand the increased instances of depression, anxiety, and more general mental health concerns? And how do you see that in your community? How do you see it? How do you see it in the day-to-day lives of people? How do you understand contending with it as a community? How do you understand it historically?
Absolutely. Well, I think, when we think about what an underserved community looks like, or at least what a marginalized community looks like, mental health is maybe not one of the issues or concepts that floats by, an individual's minds. We think about how underfunded education systems are. We think about how underfunded healthcare, infrastructure, food service, food justice, and housing institutions are. And while those may not pertain to, the two words that we believe in as what mental health is, those are all different agencies and institutions that affect our day-to-day lives, thus affecting our mental state and stability. I think the number one issue that I have received during my time in office, and this was something that I heard at the doors on the streets when I was campaigning, is that housing, whether it's the affordability crisis, whether it's, individuals about to experience homelessness, whether it's people living through homelessness themselves, this affects someone's state of being, someone's state of mind. Not only someone that isn't mentally ill at the time, but people that are mentally ill are unable to achieve the healthy way of living that we expect or hope for them to strive to be, because of a lack of stability when it comes to housing. So of course, we hear this topic in progressive politics and in leftist spaces about tackling, the root problems or the root causes of our problems. And as a council member that represents the 36th district, it's housing that I do believe is the stemming root problem or cause of many of the mentally ill individuals that do reside within my community.
So you see housing as, it's interesting. So you're making a very, very interesting point, which is that these intersecting systems of oppression contribute to and exacerbate or even cause people to have significant negative mental health outcomes. That makes a lot of sense. And it's an interesting point too, because I think we tend to sort of compartmentalize these different issues as opposed to understanding them as contributive to one another. But I wonder, I've been interested as a clinician and as a thinker in the way in which generational understanding of the treatment of mental illness impacts people's willingness to seek help. So I'm curious, in this 36th district, are there, and I don't know if there are, because I know there typically are not very many of these, are there resources that you're aware of that people in the community can turn to for mental health support services?
Not many, not many at all. And I think it speaks to, the lack of courage and leadership through our city government. And, I appreciate how you brought up the fact that $150 billion of, our government's resources goes towards mental health resources or mental health care. But in New York City, out of our $98 billion budget, when it comes to mental health resources, comparatively to, our NYPD budget or direction of Department of Corrections Department, it is a dwarf compared to the amount of taxpayer dollars that, goes to carceral agencies or carceral services. In my community, access to mental health care is not as accessible as maybe being, policed by an officer on the street. And I think that's a problem. The amount of officers that we see on the street should be less than or even equal to, at most, to the amount of mental health care professionals, whether it's outreach, whether it's intake, whether it's actual centers, like you brought up at the start of this meeting, that should be provided within communities such as mine. And I was at a dinner last week and talking to multiple people about this concept of mental health and what mental health care looks like, and the threats that many people perceive as those that are mentally ill. Most people that are mentally ill are more of a danger to themselves than they are of other people. However, that's not how they're perceived in the general light or view and from the regular day-to-day New Yorker. And because of that, there's this fear that people have of those that are struggling with mental illness. And historically within this country and in this city, when people, especially people with money, especially people that are white, are fearful of something, the answer to it is policing or jail time. And that reflects in, the budget injustice that we see within this country, thus providing a lack of mental health resources within communities of color, within the community that I do represent.
That makes so much sense. And it brings me to my next point. Interestingly, Cheryl Roberts, who is the executive director of the Greenberger Center for Social and Criminal Justice, which is an anti-carceral organization, she was talking about the Department of Corrections, sort of talking about in the context of Rikers, talking about this idea that somehow you're going to enact better mental health resources by, she said, if you are thinking about long-term closure, meaning the carceral systems, carceral environments, and looking to do something different in the next 50 years, creating basically hospital settings or hospital units inside of a jail or prison isn't the solution. It's not something to aspire to. The goal should be to stop criminalizing people with mental illness and making sure they have community-based treatment. She said, we were supposed to close down beds and have these great community mental health systems. That never materialized. So she's making the very point you're making, which is that we, particularly when it comes to Black and brown people, we tend, I believe, to criminalize mental health, to understand people who act out of illness as criminals. We incarcerate them and then treat them within the prison system with mental health resources, which in effect is exactly as you speak to. It becomes, if mental health care is bound up with incarceration, it strikes me that that is actually the inverse of what it's meant to. It's anti-liberation. It's anti-liberation. It constricts and constrains and contains and oppresses and reinforces centuries of oppression. And I'm having a hard time understanding how governments are advocating the inclusion, this sort of archaic model of mental health care. To me, it just smacks of the same old sort of racist tropes. And I wonder if you've given any thought to how we might engage with governments, with resources to provide better, stable, community-based environments for folks to turn to who are struggling, not just with significant major mental illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, but just day-to-day stressors. I'm thinking about the 36th district community, the day-to-day stressors you speak to, housing, being unhoused or having unstable housing, food instability, food deserts, family struggles, impoverished educational systems, these systemic, interwoven systemic issues. I wonder if we can imagine a way to allow for the depression, anxiety, and stress that are in the natural residue of these experiences. How do we address those things? How might we think creatively to address those things within the community? I don't know, I'm wondering.
So this is something that I think would help myself as an elected official, because a lot of what we are talking about in city government is providing more resources to mental health services. However, many of us are not, mental health care professionals or psychiatrists or individuals that work in this field. I am always looking for ideas through the people that are actually doing the work through these models on a day-to-day basis. And I look to, cities or, states like Delaware, where they are providing, alternatives to calling 911 by providing, mental health specialists to the scene instead of, cops. And I am always open to hearing from you and anyone that is out there to receive some sort of guidance on how we could work on an inside-outside strategy. One being, a municipal elected official with access to voting on a budget and access to write laws by working with individuals that know what needs to be done but aren't being heard by those that have power. Now, I really do believe that a reason why we haven't seen these community healthcare centers is, I think after the institutionalization of mental institutions where this continued in many different ways for rightful reasons, I think there wasn't much energy or courage or political will to follow through on creating some of these, community mental health care institutions, within neighborhoods or districts like mine. A part of that is, a essence of NIMBYism. People do not want, I'm saying this quote unquote, crazy people in their backyard. And two, the lack of political will and the overarching belief that the only way to handle these people is through, again, policing or incarceration.
How do you understand because this is something that I've struggled with as a white person. It's very hard to speak to this without feeling presumptuous or making assessments that I don't feel I have it's not my place to sort of make, in terms of what seems to me to be the historical sort of inheritance of a stigmatized relationship to mental health care. And I mean, going to a therapist. I don't mean somebody who's schizophrenic who clearly needs to have medication and sort of intervention, but that there are communities which, because they've been, in my senses, the history of historical exclusion and of pathologizing of just general life experience, have reticence when it comes to trusting that mental health resources may actually be helpful. And obviously part of that is we need clinicians of color. We need clinicians from within the community to be available to people of color who need resources, or understandably want to talk to people who share their experience in some way. It's not essential, but it's important.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that's something you might sort of speak to, because I know within my community of clinicians and people who think about these issues, it's challenging to know, beyond just encouraging more people of color to become mental health care providers. I'm wondering if there's a way to address that horrific history, which impacts the willingness of communities to even seek out help, or to even acknowledge that they're suffering, that there's something about the suffering that is so embedded in the experience of just being a human being in this world sometimes, for people who have been marginalized for so long, that the experience of being sort of profoundly stressed and unhappy seems normal, that it's not even questionable.
Well, I think there are multiple answers to that question. And I think the first is that, Black folks are not, a monolith, which is obviously, I'm not the first person to say that. And, there are a sizable amount of Black folks that use and acknowledge and participate in therapy and, engaging in mental health services. Of course, there are a population of Black folks that do not, but I think the largest, issue in terms of lack of using mental health resources is the lack of access and equity for communities of color and Black people as a whole. One, there are not a sizable amount of Black therapists, individuals to help Black people with Black trauma and the issues that Black people experience, which is a very unique experience compared to non-Black people. And then also, the affordability of, being able to have access to a therapist. Like, not to talk about how affordable healthcare is in this country, but even the fact that some of these healthcare companies don't take insurance for therapeutic sessions. So there's a multitude of different, setbacks to therapy and mental health resources for the Black community. And while there may be a portion of the Black community, which is true, that has some distrust with the medical industry as a whole, I do believe that the majority of setbacks rely in affordability and equity. Of course, people want the help that they need, but when you don't have the time, the money to access that need, then it does become, a second nature.
Yeah.
Or a second thought or afterthought.
An afterthought. That's a really good point. I didn't mean to suggest there was anything monolithic about my.
Oh, not at all. Yeah.
But I hear you. You're making a really good point. But you're right. I mean, it was a mistake to sort of make a general. I made a kind of overly general. I think an overly general statement. I didn't intend it to come out that, but it did. But I do feel as though it's our responsibility to engage with, to broaden the palette of available clinicians, so that we have, and to change the I mean, now that we have telehealth available, COVID has allowed for new models of intervention, which they're not, in some ways they're not ideal, but they're much easier if someone has access to a smartphone.
And it's something.
It's anything. Half an hour of a conversation on a phone is a lot easier than having to get up from your job, get to an office, sit down for 45 minutes, get back, go home from work. It's less time. It can be reasonably, if not very effective. It's a problem, as you say, of access. And I think it's so great to know that this is something that you have on the front burner, along with the 87 other front burners on your stove, but it's there and it's wedded to the other issues in a way that I think it's a tremendous mistake to undervalue, because I think historical trauma, inherited generational trauma, the impact on functioning, the impact on self-advocacy, the impact on outcomes and life experience is so profound. And I feel as though until we address that issue within oppressed and marginalized, historically marginalized communities, we are going to see the suffering continue, because there is enormous suffering. There's enormous strength. I mean, what the power to sort of soldier on despite the suffering is what's really extraordinary. I mean, I find it extraordinary that in this city, we don't have 10,000 times more extraordinary mental illness. I mean, it's astonishing to me people are as resilient as they are, given how much suffering there is. And one thing that you've only been in office for what, 4 months, 4 months, but you've already managed to kind of create an extraordinary sense of camaraderie, community, and support in the 36th district that had not existed before. But that speaks to the power of one person's passion and one person's commitment to understanding systems and the intersecting systems of oppression, and the way in which not only they negatively impact communities, but the way that that we can change them. The systems are susceptible to change. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate your having spent this time. I mean, it's really, really helpful to know what you have to say, to hear your perspective, and to know that you're out there. So if people want to reach out to you and ask questions or make suggestions or just simply volunteer their services, how would you like them? What's the best way to reach your office? How should people do that?
Oh my God, DM me on social media. I am a Gen Z elected official. So Instagram or Twitter, Osse, or, email my office, district 36 at council.nyc.gov. Always open to hearing questions, comments, and concerns. And Nina, you have a great interviewer / podcasting voice you should be on NPR, honestly. But
thanks,
please do reach out if you have any ideas, especially too about the types of action plans that we as the government should be following suit with, especially if it's in a non-carceral lens.
Sounds great. Thank you, Chi. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Good luck. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.